This podcast contains content that may be triggering, so please practice self-care, knowing that you can stop, pause, and regulate at any point. In our description, you'll find a free resource to help you do just that, to ground throughout your listening experience. I want to welcome Navila Rashid, who is a Muslim, queer, Bangladeshi-American, trauma-informed forensic social worker, community educator, and gender-based violence consultant. Navila is also the co-author of The Sex Talk, A Muslim's Guide to Healthy Sex and Relationships, and the co-founder of The Cathartist in 2012, a web-based platform for victims and survivors, allies, and co-conspirators to find a safe, judgement-free home for their storytelling. Navila is the director of training and survivor advocacy at Heart, Women and Girls. Welcome, Navila.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for saying yes. I'm excited to chat with you about just so much. But I always like to start with inviting folks to share their story about what brought them to the work that they do today.
Yes. I mean, it's so funny because you read my bio and a part of me is like, wow, I might need to update some of these things. There's just so much here. And in good ways. I think like that's a part of bios is like you develop, you grow, and so do the bios. But in terms of what brought me into this work,
Mm.
um, I originally thought like, listen, I need to go to medical school. That is the proper Brown thing to do. And I went to this university where I was just filled and amongst all of these folks who either wanted to go into pharmacy or like med school track. And so the funny thing is that my parents never said you needed to do this, but I like somehow like kept hearing this voice of like, that is where you're going to find your worth, which sadly was a wake up call because hard sciences is not my forte. But the reason I share this is because it really pushed me into very uncomfortable situations in terms of understanding, like, okay, what is it that I want
Mm.
versus what is it that I think I need to do? And so this actually takes me into my post back. And this is where things get interesting. Right before I go into my post back, I started to come out more publicly around my child sexual abuse that I had experienced. And I first started telling these stories to my closest friends.
Mm.
And what ended up happening was out of like the 7 or 8 of them that I spoke to, almost all of them except for one had experienced something similar. And so for me, I was just in a very weird way, I was like, oh my God, this is exciting because I'm
Mm.
not the only one.
Yeah.
And then it was like a sudden, like, wait, but why did this happen to us? Like, this is awful.
Mm.
And so I sat with that a lot when I was an undergrad as I was kind of grappling with, oh my God, I need to go to med school or I need to become a pharmacist. But there was a disconnect there. There was a disconnect in terms of like my mind and body was experiencing life in a very different way than what my like intellectual, logical brain was like trying to force me to do.
Yeah.
So when I was in my post back, one of my close friends, um, she disclosed to me some things around her own abuse that she had experienced. And I basically tried to be as supportive as I could. And something she mentioned to me was, wow, you're really good at this stuff. Like, you're really good at, well, first of all, you've experienced it. So there's that relational aspect and that connectedness. But you're also helping me kind of figure out what I want to do, what I need to do for my healing. And I sat there and I was thinking, wow, like, I guess I'm good at something because I knew I wasn't good at orgo, organic chemistry, or physics, or any of those things. And I'm like, why am I trying to push myself into this field, which Also, for me, the draw was you can help people. So
Mm.
I think this big shift, right, in terms of you can still help people, but it can look different. And so for this really close friend of mine to kind of introduce me to like a new way of being able to show up for people really pushed me into the direction of social work. And so a lot of that is what kind of shaped the beginnings of getting into the field of gender-based violence. So I became public. I
Mm.
started The Cathartist actually with another friend of mine who had also experienced such similar experiences of violence. And we were just so over it. And we were always venting to each other. And we were like, okay, venting can only go so far. So that's why we also created that, because there were parts of us that were, that not were, are extremely creative. So we needed to kind of merge and see what does the creative have to do with the healing aspects of this type of trauma that's so deeply rooted from such informative years of you as a child. So that's where the cathartist started, but also like that journey of going into social work, eventually forensic social work, and really kind of finding my footing in this particular field of work. And more to this story that kind of solidified why I wanted to stay in this work is that when I was doing my master's in social work, I actually got assaulted, sadly. So I
Mm.
guess maybe I should just put trigger warning for my whole like, how did
Well,
I
the
come
whole
to work?
podcast has a trigger warning because it's all,
Okay.
yeah. So that, yeah. Oh.
Yeah, so yeah, during my master's, and the master's was specifically around me going into forensic social work so that I could create like spaces for Muslim survivors of sexual
Mm.
violence, domestic violence, gender-based violence, whatever you want to name it, specifically around like what does it look like so that people like me, when I was experiencing things, didn't feel alone.
Mm.
So when I was assaulted in my master's, I really had another wave of like, I'm doing this work. How did this happen? How did I allow this to
Mm.
happen? Right? Which is a lot of times the narrative that
Mm-hmm.
many victims and survivors like share with like within themselves. Um, but I pushed through. And then that's kind of where I found my footing in forensic social work. I started doing work with people who harm. I will say that is not for the weak and it is not for all victims and survivors. And for me, it was way too close to when I was assaulted, but miraculously, it was the thing that made me feel grounded because I
Mm.
felt like I have no idea how, but working with people who harmed, people who harm was my way of almost humanizing them to the point of recognizing that this work is not just about prevention
Mm-hmm.
and finding the tools and the resources to support victims and survivors, but also shifting the narrative so that the onus isn't on victims and survivors because
Yeah,
you want to tackle violence, you need to also include the people who harm and kind of get into that psyche. Like, what's going on here? There
that's
needs
right.
to be accountability. There needs to be a push to change or to choose to change.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because ultimately there's choice. There are times where there's no choice, but most of the times when we think about power and control, there's choice. So how do we shift that narrative? So that's how I came into this work and stayed, and I'm still staying.
Yeah. I mean, I wanna there's so much there and there always is, right? Because there are these like mergers of multiple events that bring folks into the work and also that keep folks into this work. Um, it often comes up who is supporting or who is working with the folks who are committing the acts of sexual violence. And there's often very little to say because there are very few people doing that work. So the fact that you were like, okay, I'm going to do this, and it is not for the faint of heart. It is really, really hard work. I wonder, the decision that made you do that in that moment, because so many folks wonder about who's doing that.
That's a really good question. And I think I've been asked this so many times. Sometimes I'll ask myself, what pushed me to do this? So immediately after, actually, I was assaulted. So that was like the big thing. Even
Mm-hmm.
my advisors during my program, my social work program, were like, why do you want to be placed in this field work, like in this internship? Are you okay?
Mm.
The reality is that my most immediate reaction for wanting to do that work and immerse myself was because I did not actually get the justice that I thought I wanted with my rapist. So I felt if I immerse myself in doing the work with people who harm, I can like just say, see, this is what you get. You need to like, I'm going to hold you accountable,
Mm.
because at least I can hold someone,
Yeah.
someone
Yeah.
who is a person who harms accountable. And very quickly did that change for me, where I'm like, okay, I'm actually getting to know these people,
Mm.
seeing them like once a week, having to travel. And again, at the time I was in New York, and so I lived in Brooklyn, but I would take the subway all the way up to the Bronx.
Oh.
Yes. Yes. So for anyone that knows that journey, it is a journey. It is a
Mhm.
journey in and of itself. So I would do that like once a week, and it changed me. It changed my like thoughts around my survivorship or my victimhood. Maybe my victimhood would be more appropriate because at the time it was just so fresh.
Mm.
And also just the beginnings of my own understanding of like what happened to me, what is justice,
Mm.
what is the complexity around the people who harm. Um, because oftentimes it's people you know.
Yes.
So holding the both and
Mm.
that simultaneity piece that, I mean, we talk about it at our organization at heart, but multiple truths can coexist. So I think those were the beginnings of me grappling with, oh my God, but like I like this person, but they caused harm, or I am like a victim, but I'm also okay, but I'm also not okay. Like just so
Mm-hmm.
much. I'm a social worker that wants to do the work for victims, but like now I'm doing this work with people who I'm like, how?
Mm-hmm.
Why? Like what's going on here?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the piece about multiple truths can exist at the same time. I think that's really hard for folks, right? I think that's also why, as a society, we so often lean towards like stranger danger because we're often teaching children that people who are most likely to harm you are the ones who don't know you. Whereas, as you said, the reality is most likely you're going to know that person, right? The stats show that to be true. Survivor stories show that to be true. But there is a deep discomfort with the idea that you can care for someone, know them, and then also they can cause harm.
Yeah, like about 95%, right?
Yep,
Is I think the more specific stat around it's not stranger danger, it's not that random monster in the bush.
that's
Like
right.
that picture that they paint, it's someone you know. And I think what that also paints a picture of is it's requiring us to have this conversation that if you get a disclosure from a child,
Hmm.
it is not from a stranger, it is someone that you know. And that means that when we are not being more transparent about it, that means adults are being complicit.
Hmm.
And
A
so,
100%.
and so that shifts the ways in which we adult, in other words, right? Like, how do we adults, but also hold ourselves accountable and recognize that we need to have these conversations with our children, with kids? It doesn't even have to be your own child,
That's right.
right? And recognizing that it's really important to like embody this idea that children should feel safe to say, this person I love and care for did something to me.
Yes.
Um, and sometimes it's really instilling this idea that the stakes are higher, um, if you speak up versus staying silent. And
Hmm.
just like that idea around silence culture being so rooted at such a young age, just so dangerous and so devastating, actually.
Yeah, entirely. And it puts a responsibility on the adults to do something. And that do something is really hard if you don't have a model of what it means to stand up for your child. If you don't know what it means to be able to confront someone who's done this to your child, right? And also, in so many conversations, what are interventions that are community based to address and create accountability? There are folks who are doing that work, but we're not talking about it enough. And so then what's left are systems that often contribute to more pain, more harm, more violence. So it's how do we sit with the yes and how do we sit with like what choices are we going to make for the children in our lives, but also for the adults in our lives and for ourselves. Like, you know, it's a whole, oh my gosh, just so much, so much there, so much for
Yeah.
folks to consider every day in the choices that we're making. But this makes me, really think about, um, you know, one of the main questions of this season of Be the Bloom is why is this, we're in 2026, right? Like a number is a number, but as we continue to go on, it is very clear that child sexual violence is being allowed to go on. And there are ways that we see this in the public in very large ways, but that also I don't feel get as much attention as it needs to get. And then there are ways that there are so many groups, so many folks, so many children whose stories are still invisible in the midst of the realities that people are talking maybe a little bit more about it, but not where we need to be. Um, so the question really is, in your view, in your experience, in your expertise, what's your take on like why this is continuing?
I could go in so many different
Go
directions.
wherever you need.
And
Out.
and I mean, you mentioned one thing, which is like at some point it's something that's so big that we all know about it, but then also not.
Mm,
And when you had previously given these questions, and I was like, okay, let me answer them, let me type this up. At the time, I mean, it's still going on, but at the time, the Epstein files was like the
yes.
thing, right?
Hmm.
And so I think for me, the honest answer is that we've actually built a world that's better at hiding child sexual
Hmm.
abuse than stopping it because it's actually easier to hide. Case in point, Epstein Island.
Hmm. And
Like,
Zorro Ranch now? Like,
right. So it's just so jarring to feel like you're in this dystopian world right now. It's
mhm,
almost like a dystopian world. I don't even know if that's the right term, but in this like really
totally
strange
right.
world where there's an island devoted to just like having this type of violence be so rampant. And I think one of your questions was like, is this still an epidemic? Like, absolutely. The stats really speak volumes because what it's showcasing is that, first of all, it's not an anomaly, it's a pattern. And what do we know to be true about patterns is that it's something rooted in something much, much deeper than just, okay, like it's happening and then what? So one thing that we really try to delve into at heart is thinking about root causes. Like, what is the root cause? It's very easy for us to think about, okay, what do we need to do? Let me get in my like go, go, go mode. We know that abuse and violence and harm is happening to children. So, like, what is my role? But the
Mm,
question is, before I even figure out what my role is, do I even know what's causing it? Kind of like
hmm.
that metaphor or that, I don't even know what the term is, but instead of like the babies that are like falling through the river,
Mm,
you don't just like you have to get to the source so that the babies don't continue to like flow down the river.
yeah.
Um, and so that's our biggest thing is like, how do we tackle this epidemic while recognizing that it's all like deeply rooted in systems
Mm,
within institutions. And that's really hard to shift because that's going to require a complete cultural like paradigm shift. How do you shift an entire culture that is so used to hiding
mm,
to then saying, oh, accountability is a thing? I may be a part of the problem. Like, I don't want
hmm.
to be seen as someone that can cause harm. And the thing about accountability, like work that we know to be true, is that everyone has the capacity to harm,
That's right.
but it's what you do afterwards that actually matters.
Hmm.
So I don't even, yeah, I don't even know what the question was anymore, but like that's
You know
kind of
what?
what's coming up for me,
No, but
which is,
that's everything you're saying. Like, if I'm hearing you correctly, right? There are, of course, layers to this. There is a culture that has been built on the idea that hiding child sexual abuse is easier than accountability. Because we actually, I can't think of a topic that we actually have accountability around that is swift, that is reparative, that transforms heart. Like I don't think there's a topic we really do this well around. And so this is a culture that very much lacks accountability as a practice or even as a full idea, right? It's an idea
Right.
in name. And so when you have that type of culture, it is much easier to hide everything. You know, my mom used to talk about like, don't sweep, you know, because I didn't really like to sweep. And so I'd end up sweep or pick it up, right? So I'd end up sweeping under the rug. And she's like, we don't sweep under the rug, and that's anything. So
Mm,
because it has to be in the light, right? You have to be accountable for what you're doing. And so we don't have that culture. So everything, including children who are being harmed, gets swept under the rug.
yep,
And we're all part of that contribution to that happening unless we do something about it.
yep.
That's what I'm hearing from you.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, the reality is that whenever accountability is absent, right, that's where we're really, if when you think about children, that's where we're teaching children that their pain is less important than someone else's reputation.
Mm, yeah, yeah.
And even when you think about accountability when it comes to violence against children, response systems are also like a source of problems because, for example, if you want to seek help from law enforcement, they're causing more harm and
Yes.
oftentimes secondary harm, right? And even more so for communities of color or folks that are even more marginalized. And so the question becomes people's distortion of what accountability even is and who gets accountability versus who's targeted. And
Yeah.
so children who are children of immigrant parents or like, you know, margins of the margins, like they are the communities outside of even the margins, like they are just even more so impacted because even when we even open the door slightly around accountability, if it's being sourced by people in power, it's never going to be true accountability.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it requires or demands more silence, right? Like,
Absolutely.
how can you, if you're, if you are afraid that your parents are going to be detained for just walking outside the door or taking you to school, right? But then you happen to be going along yourself and, or somebody else is taking you to school and that person ends up sexually assaulting you as a child. What do you do when you speak out, somebody's going to show up at the door, possibly, right? And that's kind of like a quick off the cuff, example, but it's not far fetched that these are the realities that children end up thinking about because that harm can break apart families, and there's not any liberation present with that, with the accountability that exists, because it's not true accountability.
No, absolutely not.
So, okay, sitting with this premise, right? Like, so much of this continues because we live in a culture that does not really know how to operate with accountability. Um, and it's often treated like a siloed, like child sexual abuse is treated almost like it belongs over here and it's separate from everything else. So you're talking about immigration, economics is part of this, politics, all of these things they are contributing factors, right? And so I think about the dots that need to be connected for folks that are often missing, or that we're more comfortable thinking that child sexual abuse is on its own, right? It has nothing to do with anything else. Therefore, we can't impact it. I wonder, what dots have you seen that feel so siloed, that need to be connected for folks? Like, what needs to be highlighted? What are we not seeing?
Yeah, and this is such a great question because it's actually asking us to kind of zoom out
Mm.
Because when we're so zoomed in on like the individual, like, oh, you are a survivor or victim of child abuse, or this child experienced harm and violence. Okay, let's compartmentalize and like address it and deal with it. But when you zoom out and you look at systems and you look at institutions and you look at the sources of power that really just kind of solidify our deep rooted conditioned ideas around racism, around like capitalism, around immigration, around homophobia, even,
Yep,
right?
understood.
When I'm Muslim and Heart is an org run by Muslims for Muslims, when we think about Islamophobia, like
Hmm.
there's just so much connecting of the dots. And one graphic that we often use is the iceberg, where it's a graphic, but it's also like this imagery of the iceberg. Everything above the iceberg is surface level attention to what we need to do when there is rupture in the community, when we find out that someone we love or have pedestaled, like a scholar,
Hmm.
has caused harm in some very deep ways, whether it's to children or to adults. And so, what we fail to do as a society is look beneath the surface of this iceberg and think about, okay, what's at the root of it? Because now, what this community might do where they're experiencing rupture is band-aid. Let's do a consent workshop. Let's
Mm.
do this one-off workshop that's showing the community that us as an institution, we're doing something about it. But you're actually not, because you're not going beneath the surface.
Yes.
And so that's one of the biggest things for me is that child abuse should not be like siloed because it is something that is of a bigger issue, which is just violence, period. Or like in
Hmm.
this field, what we call gender-based violence, which is like the umbrella, and then you have all the other forms of violence. So there's just so much here. And you talked about, economics, immigration, and there's also this piece around faith. And
Hmm.
so what happens when we introduce faith into this picture in terms of what is known to be a safe haven for not only folks wanting to experience and engage in spirituality and religiosity, but also just a safe haven for feeling that sense of belongingness. Sure, it's there. It's a space for healing, for community building, but also what we know to be true. And it's not just within Muslims, it's actually across the board amongst many different faiths.
Hmm.
But it can also be a source of creating an environment that is producing and enabling silence and abuse.
Hmm.
And so, back to the simultaneity piece, what happens to children that are experiencing harm from a religious teacher that they are going to for lessons? It's hard, right? Because it's allowing ourselves to, again, not hold ourselves accountable and allowing people in power use their power to then basically teach children, right? They're using their religious authority to teach children that you're going to go up against the word of God
Mm.
if you don't align with and protect me and what we have together,
Yeah.
which
Oh.
is spiritual abuse. It's harm, right? It's the misuse of a religious tradition, scripture, authority, right? To do this type of misconduct and this type of harm to an individual. So, it's really, really disgusting. And again, to connect the dots, like we see that everything points back to institutions and systems. They hold the power. And so if we're not thinking about who holds power and who makes decisions,
Hmm.
who needs to be held accountable, then we lose the bigger picture of it's not just looking at the individual, because the individual is going to be impacted regardless.
Yeah.
When it comes to poverty, we see that violence is happening and their communities of color are the ones that are actually getting targeted the most.
Hmm.
And when they are targeted, certain social safety nets that should be in place for communities of color, when they are not in place, it actually forces said communities to like figure out like housing, because
Yep.
we have such a big housing instability crisis, right?
Hmm.
It's really pushing communities of color to think about, we have no economic cushion to like support us because the system does not support us. And that's a policy choice. And where do policies live? Not on the individual level.
Nope.
It lives in the systematic level.
Mm,
So for me, the dots always connect back to what's the root? What
yeah.
is the root cause of violence? Who holds the power and control? And who makes decisions?
Yeah. And I appreciate like as you zoomed out, right? And looked at kind of like this overarching piece. And then even like within that, you looked at Islamophobia and then looked at how that can show up in the one-on-one relationship between a child and their teacher, right? And then how 100% this exists in every faith. But not but, and the presence of Islamophobia that is perpetuated on a policy level, on a system wide level, um, creates conditions, just as racism creates conditions and homophobia creates conditions. And so I appreciate you sharing like that landscape because it really does need to be like it needs to be at the forefront of our minds that things that policies, practices, they turn into habits, they turn into ways that we operate, and then it contributes to that larger ways in which we get to not be accountable and continue to hide.
Exactly.
Yeah. So then when we get to we talked about the consequences of this, the lack of awareness that exists as well around this. Um, I want to kind of hone in a little bit about Muslim women and girls and the ways that this impacts specifically in the work that you do, Muslim women and girls, and this kind of piece around Islamophobia and survivorship. And like, what have you found that needs more tending to specifically in the work that you're doing now?
Yeah. I mean, we have an entire department that's like devoted to this.
Mm,
And it all is linked to thinking about reproductive life, like an
yeah.
individual's reproductive life. And so when we're thinking about a Muslim survivor and how they navigate their reproductive life, it's extremely dynamic and vast. And it it's not just about, okay, I'm gonna get pregnant or I have decisions I need to make around contraception. I want an abortion. It also extends to things like gender affirming care, having access to knowing what you need to ask your provider. What do I know to be true about my body?
Hmm.
And so when we think about reproductive life in this way, in this expansive way, you'll start to uncover all the different walls that become barriers that most systems fail Muslim survivors for. So, what do I mean by that? So, we have this resource where we talk about like barriers to disclosure in terms of, okay, what are the things that are specific to Muslim communities that is preventing them from being able to either speak up and advocate for themselves or speak up and not cause further harm to their communities?
Mm,
Because the reality of Islamophobia is so real. Surveillance is extremely real within Muslim communities. Fear of immigration and deportation is very real. So even this idea of if a child were to speak against someone they know that abused them, but like they may potentially get deported,
hmm.
which is very real. What does that child do?
Hmm.
What does an adult do? Like I'm a forensic social worker. I've also worked at direct service organizations where some of my clients whose spouses were undocumented, they were in fear because it's like I want to seek justice and justice isn't through the American justice system because it's
Yeah.
not just.
Hmm.
It's extremely filled with challenges and barriers, right? Because of identity. Identity is what really becomes that wall. And so when we think about Muslim survivors and the different types of things that come up for them as they navigate their reproductive life, it's almost placing this extreme pressure on Muslim communities to keep anything related to sexuality, for example, private, right?
Mm.
Like this almost social pressure of this is not something that needs to be spoken out about in the public. And when we start to talk about and have these conversations about sexuality and privacy,
Mm.
with children, we start to create a section or like a concept within children where, again, silence. Silence is something that is respected and valued because it protects the community, it protects your
Yeah.
family, it protects you, it protects the religious authority.
Yeah.
All of that happens. Like the silence is actually really important, but it's also in this work we know is actually very dangerous.
Mm.
And so another thing that could happen for Muslim survivors is that because silence is something that they're conditioned to believe is important, this might lead to them facing extreme spiritual guilt and self-blame, especially if we're talking about faith. Many times speaking up makes Muslim survivors feel like they're confronting and going up against being Muslim.
Mm.
It's almost like, oh, but I'm speaking up against God. This person, this scholar that I follow and respect, who I feel that connectedness to God through them, I'm violating and betraying them. This is a
Mm.
betrayal. And now I'm betraying my whole religion. So it really deteriorates someone's own like self-awareness around spirituality and religiosity, where again, that self-blame becomes that very common factor amongst victims in general. And so now imagine what happens when children are also kind of embodying that self-blame and
Yeah.
taking on that spiritual guilt and doubling down even more on the silence.
Yeah. And I just want to like echo everything you're saying because I think it's so, so important and really hard for some people to really empathize or feel, right? Like we can hear it, people can hear it, but to really feel what it means to believe and be connected to a faith and to the idea that someone is a representative of God, whoever that God may be, and being just really raised to believe in the values, the connection, the and the cognitive dissonance that happens when it's so you're experiencing someone be different than this relationship that you have that is so meaningful and deep and part of you, and how that can be such an internal conflict that folks are navigating every day. And a child who doesn't have the answers sometimes about what's actually happening to them, feeling in conflict with themselves, and that deepening of that shame and that guilt, and what that does to the mental health of that child, the creation of anxiety, of depression, of deep self esteem challenges, like all of the things around, you know, faith and the violence. And the faith, in truth, is not really what the person is connecting, like, is separate from the way in which somebody is framing it in order to say, protect me as I harm you.
Exactly. And it's difficult because when we try to think about even systems that are meant to help and support survivors, whether you're a child or an adult, we can see a replication of harm even within these systems. So if we think about like the health system, for example,
Hmm.
if a visibly Muslim woman walks in, we can see the biases that a healthcare provider can hold if they're making assumptions about this visibly Muslim woman and saying, she's Muslim, you know what? She's not going to want a pregnancy. I mean, an abortion, because
Mm.
I believe that Islam forbids abortions.
Mm.
So, very harmful assumption, also extremely inaccurate, and it pushes narratives around Muslims even further where it's stereotyping, and that stereotyping is also violent
Yes.
because then it allows providers to not fully be immersed in being able to support the survivor and give them the tools and the resources, or engaging with them in much more meaningful ways to say, I actually don't know anything about Islam other than what I am being fed through social
Hmm.
media. What actually is helpful here? Like, what is it that they need? And when
Yeah.
we think about children, I've seen this happen during my time in New York, where I actually was a consultant with CPS, Child Protective Services.
Mm,
And some of the caseworkers that would come to me for questions, um, whenever it was about a Muslim family, like almost the tone or like the understanding or the prevention methods would shift completely, where it's like they're coming in with these biases around, well, there must be harm because
mm,
Muslim men are harmful and aggressive. Abuse is happening for sure. This child is exposed to violence and harm, and we must intervene.
mm.
And so a system that is meant to protect children, when you start to have these types of biases and stereotypes, again, just so much harm. Sure, maybe there is violence and harm happening. However, again, let's try to kind of unpack what's going on here.
Yeah.
Like what are we exposing? What are we surfacing? And like what is it that we actually need to get to the root of? Not extraction immediately, right? Extraction is not
No.
always the answer. Sometimes the answer is what is the lack of resources being provided to these families? Do they have language access? Is there housing access? Is there like access to groceries and healthcare?
Yeah.
Are
Yeah.
they able to like send their child to the school, or are they in a district where it's just not the best option for them? And now, there's just so much that goes on. And so my time during working with CPS, it was just so hard because having to hear these stories and thinking about their intervention methods, it was just getting so exhausting because I
Mm.
ultimately knew, I can't necessarily fault these caseworkers. It's the entire system.
Yeah.
The entire system was built to set these families up for failure. And what do we do with that?
Yeah. They were doing what they thought they needed to do, right? What they're taught to do. And yet, I venture to say, like, at some point, maybe it becomes on all of us to start questioning that or to find some other options out of that because it won't change if we don't, right? Like you were in there doing that work, asking those questions. But you're right. If we continue to just take children out of homes just because of biases and assumptions that are un unverified, unknown, and are rooted in things that are rooted in phobias that folks have that are unaddressed, we're not going to get anywhere, right? Children will continue to be harmed, even though there's the idea that, oh, we're helping. We're not really doing that. We're contributing to the layers of trauma that are being experienced. So much of what you're talking about is, you know, what care providers need to know, right? Like, what are the things that folks need to do? So, a lot of like with Cactus in Bloom, through a lot of our trainings, we're doing a lot of work around bias awareness, around um, connecting with approaches versus like, this is exactly what we need to do. But what is the approach? What's the foundational set of practices? How do we need to look at a circumstance that is trauma informed and trauma reducing, culturally humble, all of those foundational ways, because we can always figure out a solution to something.
Mhm.
But are we entering in with the right approach, so to speak, that allows that person to really have as much power in the space or acknowledge our power in the space as care providers, and for us to mitigate that? Because when we don't understand our power, we will cause harm. And so, what else do you feel like care providers need to know in order to do no harm, so to speak?
Yeah. I mean, the reality is that when we're thinking about what care providers can do specific to like Muslim communities,
Yeah.
Muslim survivors, Muslim children survivors, um, it's that first of all, there are so many good intentions of so many of these providers that I've worked with throughout my time in this field.
Yeah.
But the reality is that good intentions don't close the gap.
Mm,
What really is needed is trainings. and investment, but most importantly, relationship building.
Yeah.
So to go back to my story about working at CPS, there was one, I'll share an anecdote, but there was one family that needed an interpreter. And so my particular job and role was that I legally could not be an interpreter and also be like the consultant to give intervention methods or suggestions or blah, 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 blah. I chose at that moment that I needed to be the interpreter because the interpreter that was on the phone for this particular family was completely just sharing the circumstances of this family in ways that were actually going to cause this family more harm.
Mm.
And so I stepped in and I started to interpret, and then I had to speak to my supervisor, where I was like, I know I can't have this dual relationship, but I really need you to know that we need to have better interpreters. Because if we want to protect children, we also need to protect the integrity of the roles that different people play at these different moments of intervention when we have systems like Child Protective Services.
Yeah.
And so the reason I share this story is what would it have looked like for CPS to have invested in more trainers, better
Mm.
interpreters, more trainings for their staff where they can build their nuance around not just cultural humility, but like also
Mhm.
spiritual humility.
Yes.
I think people have this notion that Muslims look one way, but Muslims are actually not. If we're thinking about Muslims specifically in North America, it's extremely diverse. They're
Mm.
racially diverse. They're diverse in their like the Islamic schools of thoughts, which means how they practice Islam is also very diverse.
Mm.
Where they live is diverse. Socioeconomic status is diverse. Like Muslims, you'll find everywhere, pockets of Muslims everywhere around the nation, and
Mm.
they look very different. So when we start to think about what does it mean to have nuance, like a nuanced understanding of Muslims, it's going to force providers to recognize that they might have actually provided a lot of care to Muslims, but they visibly didn't look Muslim. And to your point, it goes back to the internal biases, like the internal work. What is the internal work that needs to happen? And so, in terms of the things that we like to do and want to kind of continue to do with providers, is really closing that gap and thinking about what is it that we can showcase to providers in terms of them understanding that there's a difference between Islam and patriarchy, for example,
Mm.
like that there are many barriers that Muslim survivors face that come from patriarchal cultural norms, which is not Islam, but
Mhm.
is wrapped in religious language, right? And it is so far removed from the Islamic theology itself. And we could say the same for any other religion.
Yes.
It's how the religion is so distorted and pulled apart to fit the needs of the patriarchy.
Under 100%. Yeah.
And so it's really thinking about like how can we allow a space for providers to kind of sit with that information and think about instead of causing more harm, how do we build trust? And by building trust means collaborating with
Mhm.
organizations, and not to do a plug, but
Do a
organizations
plug.
like organizations like Heart, where we're doing the research, where we're working with the communities, where we're really collecting data to understand, okay, what is it about our faith community where either there is a distortion of what Islam is versus what is the lived reality and experiences
Mm.
of Muslim survivors? And how do we reapproach Islam and Islamic values in a way that is actually rooted in things that are not privacy, secrecy, and all the things that have more negative connotations? How do
Yeah.
we reroot ourselves in Islamic values that are more aligned with compassion, accountability,
Mm.
justice, right? Like respect. And
For
they
sure.
seem like lofty terms, but they're just terms and values that actually that should be the basis. That's where we should start off with.
But doesn't that go back to like what's at the roots, right? Like those are all the elements at the roots that I hear you speaking about, right? Whereas um it has almost been in so many people's minds co-opted that patriarchy means this, but it's not. It's, patriarchy is a tool to maintain, keep, power in many ways. And so then it gets wrapped around the idea um, of something that it doesn't belong to it. And
Yeah.
so I'm hearing you like these have to be separated, not just in the world we live in, but it has to be separated in people's minds and in care providers' minds because it reduces the choices
Right.
automatically that folks have when they walk into the door because of how, you know, Islamophobia is so present in people's like minds, but often not talked about and not internally investigated.
Yeah. And it's really thinking about reframing it where we're not looking at a survivor's faith as the obstacle, but rather thinking of how do we work with that survivor, irregardless of what their
Yes.
faith is.
Yeah.
And so even to that point, like Hart created many different frameworks, and it's almost a four-tiered approach. We start on the individual level, then we go to the interpersonal, then community, and then
Mm.
lastly, institutions and leadership. And each framework that is within each of these four tiers is meant to really take us along a journey, not only for providers, but also for allies, advocates, co-conspirators, people who have loved ones that are survivors or victims,
Yes.
right? Like these frameworks are meant to support anyone. And it starts off with the NIA, which is intention
Mm.
framework. And this is something that you talked about, which was the biases part, right? Like, what do we know to be true about ourselves and what do we need to disrupt? Because we know that white dominant culture habits are real. We all have them internalized.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a lifelong work that we need to do to kind of disrupt that because it shows up in like such subtle ways. And it can happen with providers. We've seen it happen so many times. That's
Mm-hmm.
why we're called to do trainings or, do some professional development or provide technical assistance. It's
Mm-hmm.
because certain organizations are recognizing, yeah, like our work is rooted in this. So how do we like parse it out? Because
Yeah.
there is this intention, this NIA to want to do better and to show up to do better,
Mm.
right? And then the next one is our Rahma framework, which we use. This is our most famous one. It is our most used one and is one that is extremely, um, unfortunately, needed the most because it's the responding with Rahma framework, Rahma, which is
Mm-hmm.
compassion. How do
Mm.
you respond to a disclosure? So we work a lot with providers to think about the different steps it takes to work with Muslim survivors specifically. And I only say Muslim because actually, in reality, all survivors of sexual violence or gender-based violence, they experience very similar things.
Mm.
The Muslim aspect is where we're really thinking about that spiritual abuse, that faith
Yeah.
component, to say this is kind of where we want folks to build a little bit of nuance and understanding of how to work with Muslim clients, given their faith or association with faith, and also the Islamophobia or actually gendered Islamophobia piece.
Mm.
And really thinking about, okay, these are the things that are actually happening within the community or things that are going to impact your Muslim survivor client.
Yeah.
So that particular framework really walks whatever role you are through that process and having you think about, okay, how do I not re-traumatize and how can I use this framework to center the survivor?
Mm-hmm.
And this framework purposely doesn't talk about accountability
Mm.
because what we've recognized is it's almost a gut reaction to go into action mode.
Yeah.
So our Rahma framework is meant to slow us down and to say, okay, what we know to be true about survivorship or victimhood is that autonomy and agency have been taken away.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we work to build that?
Yeah.
It takes time. It takes a lot of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's our Rahma framework. And then we finally go into Amana and Adala. Amana is community responsibility and Adala is justice. So
Mm.
that we kind of reframed as institutional accountability. So, like the Imana framework, because we're looking at that as a God-given responsibility, what does
Mm.
that look like on a community level? Like, what is the community's role in preventing any type of gender-based violence?
Yes.
Instead of protecting the perpetrators or people who harm, which happens every single day,
That's right.
How can we actually push communities to say, no, let's do better, let's reframe. We don't need to spend time protecting these perpetrators, these
Yeah.
people who are constantly causing harm. We need to be more survivor centered. What does that look like?
Mm-hmm.
And then the
That's
last one,
beautiful.
yeah. I mean, it's so wild because sometimes communities also feel like they are also in investigative mode, and they're
Mm.
also quick to say, okay, we're going to make the decision to cast out this person who caused harm.
Mm.
But a part of accountability is recognizing that when you cast someone out, they will go to a different community and continue to
That's
cause harm. You're
that's
not
right.
really addressing the problem. You
Yeah.
aren't going back to the root cause. And
Yeah.
so that Amana framework also pushes communities to delve deeper into being able to identify root causes
And can
better
I
and faster.
and I want to like just take a moment there because I can imagine folks listening to this and just how would lives have been different and the lives of so many children who've experienced sexual violence if they had a community looking out for them or a community that had that type of practice collectively to protect them.
Yeah,
Like, I don't know. That would have been life changing for me, right? But I didn't have that. And instead it was the protection, through religion. I grew up Pentecostal, right? Through religion to protect the perpetrator of harm. And so I can imagine so many survivors my healing would have been different. So
yeah,
that needs like a moment and I want folks to like really take that in that could be a value collectively. I
yeah,
wonder, like, access to folks learning more about this one before, like, I know there's one more, right? But is there
yeah.
space where folks can learn more about Amana? Is it?
Yes, Amana. And the way that our frameworks works is that before you even get to the last two, which is Amana and Adala, you have to really try to root yourself in Nia and
Mm,
Rahma.
yeah.
Because one of the premises of Nia and Rahma is that you start doing this work by starting under the premise that you believe survivors.
Mm, wouldn't that be
So,
lovely?
and I'm like focusing on this is because we have at heart, we have encountered way too many people interested in doing the community responsibility work. And it's hard to get them there
Yeah.
and to work with them because they're actually not starting from the premise of believing survivors.
Mm.
They're starting from the premise of, but some people are falsely accused.
Oh,
Some of our revered scholars are falsely accused. What do you have to say about that?
very different place to even begin.
Well, what we have to say is that 0.005% are actually falsely accused, and the
Mm-hmm.
percentage is much higher of those that are reporting or actually are not reporting but are still experiencing harm from
Yeah.
said scholars. Um, so that is why we like to have folks sit with Rahma and Nia much more because if you're not coming into this work really centering survivorship or victimhood or recognizing that there's a lot of work to be done to undo a lot of our own biases that we hold in terms of what does a survivor even look like?
Mm-hmm.
There's so much stereotyping, right? When we think about like child survivors, so much stereotyping around what they look like, what they said, what they should say, what they should appear as,
Mm-hmm.
like it's just so disappointing. And so the way folks can access is actually going on our website. A lot of these frameworks, actually all the frameworks that I'm mentioning is accessible. It's free on our website. And then if folks want to go deeper, we do provide trainings for each of these
Awesome.
frameworks. And then also each of these frameworks come with supplemental manuals. So we've created like these very detailed manuals to also offer case studies, to offer like some scripts, to offer different scenarios, and to offer language to say, We don't have all the answers, but we
Mm.
do have something to work with, which is research, which is lived experiences, which is our skill set and expertise and training in this.
Hmm.
Enough so to say this is what is going to work because we know what doesn't work and it hasn't
Mm.
worked.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be 36 this year. There's so many things that don't work that are keep being pushed down our throats.
Yeah.
In my 36 years, that's what's no, we know what doesn't work. I don't know why we keep going to certain things or intervention methods and things like that. So
Yeah.
that's where folks can actually access a lot of this stuff.
And
So
we'll
we're not
link
here
to
to
all of it.
gatekeep. Yes, we can definitely link. I will share. Um, because it should be accessible, right? Like
Hmm.
what we're offering in these frameworks are not like I don't say revolutionary. I think it's kind of revolutionary, but it's not anything different. It's actually very well-known concepts and ideas
Mm.
and phrases and values. It's just putting it together and saying, this is an organized way for us to actually conceptualize and think about how we can be better and do better for survivors.
Okay.
This is not different language. This is not anything you don't know.
Yeah.
You don't know what you don't know. But if you know yourself, then you should know, in what direction you want to head because people have choices.
That's right. That's right. So, I mean, I always ask about resources that care providers need to look into, but you have taken us there, which is great, right? And so, are there, and I know like there's so many amazing trainings through Heart, research that's being done. Are there any books or anything else that you think care providers would benefit from?
Yes, we are a small but very mighty team. And so not only do we have many resources on our website that are easily accessible and downloadable, we also did release and publish a book. So this August, it'll have been 4 years. It's our sex talk book, a Muslim guide to healthy relationships, um, and really kind of setting the premise of what sexual health education actually should look like.
Hmm.
So this I highly recommend. And I know it's talking about Muslims and it's also written by Muslims. But a very common review or like feedback that we've gotten from non-Muslims is actually this is still relevant. Maybe it was nice to have that chapter of what does Islam have to do with it, but
Hmm.
that was much more informative. But everything else is still very much needed in my life,
Hmm.
irregardless of me being Muslim or not.
Yeah.
And so I highly recommend for providers and also anyone that is a survivor, right?
Hmm.
Whether you experience child sexual abuse and you're an adult now, or you know someone who has a child that's experiencing harm and violence, this is
Hmm.
a great book to also kind of think about what are these conversations you want to have, specifically around consent and specifically around understanding what a healthy relationship is or is not. We introduce our RIDHA framework in that book, and RIDHA is fullness of choice.
Hmm.
And that we created a tool to kind of say, how can you identify when things go wrong or when things feel right?
Hmm.
And so the book itself is not just like a textbook, but it's like reflection questions, it's like to-dos, it's where can you find more resources? Because one thing that we also really value at heart is making sure we cite everybody that we know. Like we couldn't have done this work if it hadn't have been for all the women of color before us that
Hmm.
have paved the way and done so much of this research and so much of this work. And it would like behoove us if we didn't also think about what it means to kind of honor them. So this book in some ways is like honoring all these voices that have set the stage for this type of work and this type of research and information.
Hmm. I feel all like warm and tingly because I just this is such hopeful work. Like in the midst of all of the hard things that we're talking about and that exist in the world, it feels so hopeful to know what is being done and that it's being done so with just such deep intention and such deep like roots. I mean, I'm just going to keep with it. Like and it's beautiful. So I really appreciate you sharing all that, but also I want to encourage folks listening. there's just so much within the work that Heart is doing. There's so much. If you have 10 minutes, go online. You can find an article, you can find research, you can find, information sheets. There's something you can do with 10 minutes of your time to start to dig deeper. And then if you've got an hour, if you have, like there's a range of, at least from what I've seen, right? There's a range of ways that folks can engage and begin to learn more and to deepen their practice of being, you know, better in the work that they do.
Yeah. And I mean, again, I think our biggest thing is partner with us, right?
Yeah.
Partner with us, collaborate with us,
Hmm.
refer us to other people, fund us. Like we live in
That's
a
good.
world and age where if we're talking about like economic disparity, like the nonprofit space feels
Yes.
it hard. And
Yeah.
I know you know this, like it's just so hard to find funding to do this work. And yeah, more than anything, collaborate with us as if we're equals and not as if, you're working with us like it's just another checkbox to tick off, because
Hmm.
that is also harmful. Where, oh, well, we need to, fulfill this DEI thing at
Mm,
work. So let's get this training in, let's get heart. You're
mm.
not, again, start from the premise of believing survivors, but also start from the premise that this work is needed and that you want to invest in it.
100%. Yeah. And we'll link to everything, including if you've got like a donation link, we'll link to that as well so that folks listening can really access everything that you're talking about, including, like supporting in ways that they can. Um, okay. So my last question is there anything that maybe I haven't asked that you feel needs space?
I feel like we went through it all. We talked about connecting the dots. We talked about like systems. It's just, I feel like we could keep going on and talk for days. We really could, but I think we covered what we needed to. It's just so sad because when it comes to working with child survivors of violence, we
Mhm.
also enter like a realm which gets more complicated because they are minors. So I will say that. So things do shift. So our frameworks will shift
Mm.
when we're introducing that, when we're thinking about children or minors, or even if we're thinking about elderly folks, right? Because that's
Mhm.
also, we've got two parts of the spectrum where there's different protocols. So
Yeah.
just because there's a protocol doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be helpful. Sometimes those protocols are actually more harmful, but
Mhm.
that's also something to consider. But again, Heart will work with you. We will think about mandated reporting. We will think about other different community-based interventions that cause less harm. We'll think about and introduce things like transformative justice or restorative
Mm.
justice. Just to, again, it's better to have more options than to feel like you have no options and no choice. I mean, there's one thing that I forgot to mention in terms of resources, but we just released our podcast. And so it's two of my coworkers, incredible women, Sabrine, who is our director of health equity and education, and
Mm.
Amadullah, who is our health education coordinator, and the two of them are co-hosts. Love them, they're hilarious. But essentially this podcast is to talk about all things sexual health related. So it's just like a great space for people to go to kind of hear about like what's happening in the Muslim world, what's
Mm.
happening when it comes to this intersection of Islam and sexual health, or
Mm.
Islam and RJ, like reproductive justice, or Islam and gender-based violence. And so we're not we, but like they're hoping to get different folks to come on and speak to their craft, their expertise in this field. So, yeah, in terms of accessibility, people learn in different ways, people
Yeah.
engage in different ways. And so, if you're someone who loves audiobooks or podcasts, this is another option for
Awesome.
folks.
Awesome. What's it called?
It's called The Heart of the Matter
Ooh, great name.
because we love puns and we love acronyms at heart.
That's right. So we'll make sure to also link that so folks can connect with it. And really, I am a fan of podcasts in the sense that, yeah, it works for so many different types of learners, so many folks with different time, amounts of time, but also you get to keep up. There's so much happening in the world right now, and so if there's a place that you can go to keep up with what's happening, in a way that feels accessible to you, I 100% am like, "That's a place I wanna be." So,
Yeah.
I'm so excited that this has started, and I'm gonna listen in.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the theme of our conversation, right? Like, how do folks, um, in part, get over what's in their heads, to offer care that is full of options, that is expansive, that is giving folks access to all of the things in front of them, along with accountability, along with culture shift and society shift. And there's just so much in what we've talked about. And so I'm super grateful that we got to chat today and that you brought all of it, like you brought all of this amazing stuff to share with folks, and with me. And so I'm so grateful. And thank you for being on Be the Bloom.
Course, and I'm grateful that you even wanted to do this with us. I think that's a part of it is even these types of collaborations, like being able to hear you speak and your work, which is also extremely important. One thing I do want to share is that we don't have enough visibilized um, work around working with children and minors.
Hmm.
Again, it's so siloed or it's seen in a certain way. And so I just think everything that you are doing is just so beautiful. And I'm excited to see all the different things that you actually have in store for everybody when it comes to resources and information.
Thank you. See, collaborations are pretty amazing. And we'll see what comes out of all of it, right? But it can't be anything but good and adding to what we need.
Exactly.
There was a lot shared today, and I want to encourage folks listening to connect with what resonated with you most. Consider one practice you can take from here and move into learning more about or even practicing if it feels appropriate to do so. If you would like to support the work of Cactus and Bloom to bring you these type of conversations and to do culture change work that builds skills, creates awareness, and improves equitable care for survivors of childhood sexual abuse and sexual violence in adulthood, consider a donation. Your contribution can make a world of difference. And together, let's see what blooms.